Alright, so we are live now. Thank you so much for joining. So let's wait for just 10 seconds so that online audience can join in. Alright, so let's start. So hello, I'm Farhan, and welcome to the second episode of Anveshana, a series of expert discussion and Q&A on issues of climate change and human rights of 21st century. COP26, the biggest climate conference, ended with Glasgow Climate Pact, was endorsed by the nearly 200 countries and presents a set of principles and goals for action on climate change. While still there is no enforcement mechanism, on behalf of India, Prime Minister Narendra Modi presented his five-point agenda to counter climate change. Today, we take this as the theme and have a discourse on it with our esteemed guest, Mr. Ashish Kothari. He is renowned Indian environmentalist working on development, biodiversity policy, and alternatives. He is co-founder of Kalpavriksh, former teacher of Indian Institute of Public Administration. He is co-author of Churning the Earth, Alternative Future, and Pluriverse, the Post-Development Dictionary. Once again, Ashish sir, I thank you for being here with us in this conversation and accepting our invite.
Thank you, Farhan.
Without
Glad to be
further,
here.
thank you so much, sir. Without further ado, I would like to start the questions. So, sir, as climate change is a defining crisis of our time, and it is happening even more quickly than we feared. Rising temperature are fueling environmental degradation, natural disaster, extreme weathers, and food and water insecurities, economic disruption, sea level are rising, the Arctic is melting, coral reefs are dying, oceans are acidifying, and forests are burning. The impact of climate change can be felt on every corner of the world. To combat, to combat this existential crisis, India announced Panchamrit, the five commitment, which are like I would like to just name them. Achieving net zero by 2070, reducing total projected carbon emission by 1 billion ton starting now till 2030, increasing renewable energy component to 50% of our total energy requirement by 2030, reducing renewable energy, uh, uh, reducing carbon intensity by 25% by 2030, increasing non-fossil fuel capacity to reach 500 gigawatt by 2030. So, sir, the question is, how rational are these commitments considering the crisis and our current climate change mitigation goals?
Yeah, Farhan, I think there's two issues involved here, and I'll elaborate them later also in the conversation. First is we tend to think of climate as being a physical or physio-biological kind of a crisis, which of course it is, given everything that you were mentioning about what kind of impacts it is going to have on us, on human beings, and on the rest of the earth. Um, and its immediate causes are of course also in terms of emissions from various different sources, but it's important for us to also understand what are the root reasons for this crisis. Why are we in this situation in the first place? And unless we go there and look at the kind of macroeconomic and political forces that have brought us to
Sir,
this juncture,
I'm really
including
sorry,
going back
sir.
in, sorry.
I'm really sorry, sir. I'm interrupting you, but your internet connection is lagging a bit. Uh, it's your voice
Oh,
is cutting.
okay. Just give me a second. I'll try and put on another connection.
Yeah, yeah, sure, sure. Please take your time.
Hello, Farhan.
Yeah, sir. Yeah, sir. It's very clear now. Please, I'm really sorry for my interruption.
Okay, no, no, I don't know why suddenly the Wi-Fi went weak. Okay, so should I repeat that?
Yeah, sir. Please, it would be like,
Okay,
great.
yeah, sure. So, yeah, so I think what Farhan, what I was saying was that in response to your question is that I think there are two parts to the response, and I will elaborate them later in the conversation also. Climate change, of course, is a physical, biological crisis. It is the immediate causes are emissions of various kinds, which are leading to warming and so on and so forth. And so, therefore, in terms of the immediate responses, we also need to deal with that, whether it's carbon emissions or other kinds of things, methane and so on. But I think it's very important for us to get to the root causes of why we are in this place, in the first place. Why are we in this situation? And unless we address that, we are always going to be falling short of an adequate response. And to my mind, this needs us to understand at least the last 500 years of colonial history and the history of industrialization and what we think of as development, because we have considered development to mean more and more and more material growth, more and more energy consumption. And of course, this is not coming from thin air. We have a finite planet, and the more we produce and consume resources, the more it's going to be taxed. And so, when we throw all kinds of things into the atmosphere or into water or whatever, there is a limit to which the atmosphere can absorb it, and that limit has been crossed. So one is that, and as I said, I'll elaborate that a bit more when we look at what really could be the solutions to this problem. The second part is the feasibility of what Prime Minister Modi has announced, and the impacts of what those measures could be. Now, I won't go into too much of the techno-economic feasibility of this. There are other people who've written about it. I'm not an expert on this. People like Raj Shekhar in The Wire have written extensively about how, even in terms of the purely technological and financial feasibility of what has been proposed, there are very serious and grave questions about that. But what I'd like to get into in more detail is actually looking at what could be the impacts of the kinds of measures, these Panchamrit measures that have been talked about, and that I will do in more detail as we go along in the conversation, because I don't think that there is that sustainability and equity, especially, has been built into these goals, which I will
All
explain.
right. That's great. That's a great response. And we still need gonna get more answers as we go on. So as a developing country, like as you said, there's a like development cannot go like it has a point where it becomes unsustainable, right? So as a developing country, it is more difficult for India to go away from the fossil fuels like coal, right? Uh, than the more developed country. And even though right now India emits about 2.5 tons per person, it is way less than the world average, and the country emits 7% uh, of global emission, in spite having 17% of the global population. So, is it just to have those developed countries pressurizing these developing countries to cut down the emissions, uh, and and they are not even giving adequate financial like climate finances? So, what's your point in this?
Well, I think the point that has been made repeatedly by Indian environmentalists and also political leaders is that the crisis has been generated over the last, as I was talking about, let's say the last few hundred years, by the West, by the industrialized nations. It's not originated in countries like India. And to that extent, I mean, pointing to them and saying that you need to actually, in terms of reparation for the damage that you have caused in the past, you need to be able to take appropriate action, which includes reducing and eliminating your prone emissions, which are still very substantial, and also then being able to help poorer countries with the transition towards climate friendly economies. So the equity aspect of this is an absolutely important, and this is something where repeatedly we've been screaming our heads about it for the last, this is the 26th COP, but I think since COP1 itself, countries of the South have actually been saying that this is not something we have started, and so therefore it's important that you deal with it also. But there is another aspect to this, that even though our per capita emissions are still quite low compared to the industrialized West, um, the total emissions now are what actually matter to the atmosphere. Because for the Earth
Of
as a whole,
course.
for the atmosphere, it doesn't matter that our per capita ones, if India is now the third largest emitter in the world, that is what matters in terms of the global climate impacts, right? And so, in that sense, we do have a responsibility to take action for the Earth as a whole. But we also have an internal responsibility, because the more we actually emit, the more the impacts are going to be felt by people within the country itself. In terms of total emissions, it's felt in, in the ways in which you spoke about, whether it's going to be floods or droughts or changing rainfall patterns and uh, coastal inundation and so on and so forth, where tens of millions or hundreds of millions of people are already being or are going to be affected by this. So, in that sense, it becomes our own internal double responsibility. One is for the earth, but also for our own people and for our own wildlife and biodiversity, that we do take this very seriously. We can't take it lying down simply saying, you guys were to blame, so take action and we'll continue at business as usual, which of course is not what the government is saying. The government is saying we do want to take action, but we'll get back into looking at whether in fact that action is adequate or not.
Of course, sir. It is an existential crisis which is all over the world. So this excuse that we haven't made it will not like save our lives, right? So
Yeah,
it's
I mean, it's an important point to make, and we have to keep making it and demanding reparation, like I said, damage, compensation for damage. But it's not the only or the adequate. It's not the only response. We have to go beyond that. And when I was talking about internal equity aspects, I think it's very important also for us to realize that there's probably 50 or 100 million Indians who are emitting or who are responsible as much now for the climate crisis as the rich in industrialized countries. We are, so when we say per capita, the rich, in a sense, are hiding behind the poor. So people,
very
perhaps
true.
like you and me on this call, are already consuming more of the climate space and also destroying more biodiversity, causing more pollution, etc., than the average poor person or the average lower middle class person in India. And that internal issue of justice and inequality also has to be squarely taken into account in our response, which so far it hasn't.
Yeah, of course, sir. I'm audible, sir.
Yeah.
All right. So, sir, as you said, there's a climate space disparity, just like we have economic disparity, and like uh, India needs to work on it a lot, right?
Mhm.
So, in the process of development, last year, in a desperate attempt to become Atmanirbhar in energy production, Indian government flagged off the process to auction 41 coal mines for commercial mining. This is violation of all its internal commitment to ecological sustainability, and is also violation uh, to the rights and interests of Adivasis who inhabit in those areas. Even COP26 haven't committed enough to support the fight for indigenous people, like indigenous rights. So I just wanted to raise this question: why these conferences are not inclusive for the indigenous plight, and India is not able to empathize with its indigenous population, and why the development is still happening, uh, like uh, still happening after knowing that it's going to be in the long term damage to our own uh, ecology and the biodiversity.
Yeah, so I think, Farhan, this goes back to the point I made first, which is to look at the root causes of the crisis, right? Now, if we think of, in a way, the root cause being who is taking decisions with regard to what kind of energy pathways, what kind of development, etc., we realize that those decisions are being taken by a small section of the population in India as also globally, which are those who are the most powerful, right? Either economically powerful, which could be private corporations and so on, in capitalist corporations, or politically powerful, which could be, say, the politicians and the bureaucrats in any country. So it's the same in India, where, for instance, who defines Atmanirbharta, right, or self-reliance? Who defines what should be our energy transition is happening in New Delhi, okay, or New Delhi plus Mumbai, or wherever some of the biggest corporations are. So let me, in fact, go a little bit deeper into this. So when India says, or when the Prime Minister announces that 500 gigawatts of non-fossil fuel energy, or 50% of our total energy, will be from renewable energy, there's two things that are kind of hidden under carpet here, which people are not realizing. One, non-fossil fuel energy includes nuclear power and large dams, large hydroelectricity. In fact, they've just announced that 79 large hydroelectricity projects with 30,000 megawatts have been cleared, approved by the cabinet just yesterday or day before yesterday. Now, large hydroelectricity projects, as we know, have had huge impacts in terms of displacement of people, mostly poor people, Adivasis, etc. And of course, also the submergence of valuable natural ecosystems, including forests. So, if we're going to get 70, 80 more such projects in the name of uh, our climate
Renewable energy.
commitments, uh, yeah, and in the name of saying we're trying to do what we can for the climate, we are actually um, it's a very problematic way of looking at it. And in fact, also large reservoirs are known also to be adding to the emissions that are causing the climate crisis. So they're not necessarily clean in that sense, right? Nuclear power, we know, definitely is not clean. Nobody is answering this question about what will happen to the nuclear waste, which will continue to be toxic for generations and generations and generations. We're just pushing this problem on to the next few generations, plus being unhealthy or hazardous even where they are right now. So this is one thing that's hidden. The second thing that's hidden is that even when we talk about renewable energy, sorry, the second thing that's hidden is that if 50% of the energy is going to come from renewable, 50% is still going to come from non-renewable, right? Or non-clean, including, as you mentioned, coal. So not 40, but 60 new coal mining blocks have been auctioned, including in central India, some of the most biologically diverse rich forests and also Adivasi lands. Now, and India, in fact, was also instrumental in last minute changing that thing of phasing out coal to phasing down coal.
Yeah.
Phasing down is an Indian English. Nobody's ever heard of it before. Nobody knows what it means. But it was kind of very clear signal that we are not thinking of in any
Committed.
way reducing. Forget about reducing. We know that there are plans to increase coal mining and thermal power. So that's the second thing that's hidden. The third thing that's hidden is that even with the so-called clean sources, let's say solar and wind, most of the production is going to come from large projects, mega projects, or mega parks, as they call them, right? So, for instance, in Kutch, in some of the most ecologically fragile areas, and also areas that are very important for our pastoral, animal husband, livestock raising communities, 60,000 hectares has been given for a solar mega park. In Changthang in Ladakh, extremely fragile and very, very important ecology, there's a proposal for 20,000 acres to be given for a solar mega park. Now, it sounds great that we'll produce so much renewable energy, but at what cost and at whose cost, and who will get the energy and who will actually lose out in these massive land takeovers is something that is not being discussed. So I think these are at least three very crucial problems with the way this whole thing of 50% renewable, etc., is being talked about. And here, I think we need to ask this question, which we can discuss in more detail because this is part of also the solutions, is that nobody in government is asking the question, how much energy do we really need? Yeah. So it's as if every demand for energy is justified, and then we have to find some way of producing it. Now, if we keep demanding more and more and more and more energy, I'm not talking about poor people who definitely need more energy. And there's a very large number in India who know that you need that. But people like you and me also keep demanding more energy. We used to do things with the hand, now we want to do it with a machine. We have appliances of all kinds, gadgets of all kinds, all of which need electricity. So somewhere it has to be produced. The question has to be asked of consumption. How much consumption is justified? How much consumption is needed? And how much consumption is actually luxury? And unless we ask that question, we will never be sustainable with any source of energy. So that is not being asked, unfortunately. And that's a crucial part of the solutions, which I can talk about later.
So, like, we need to fix consumption and demand, and we need to have a proper uh, kind of fixation done by the government itself uh, on how much energy can be used. Because as the economic disparity, there is also, like, with economic disparity, there is the more person can afford, the more they use things. Like, there's materialistic disparity, energy disparity, and there's so many disparities going on. And India is like one of the top in disparities, economic disparities. So we need to work on
Yeah.
it, of course. And if and
So, Farhan, one of just to add here, one of the things that in Prime Minister Modi's speech in Glasgow, he coined a new acronym, LIFE, which means lifestyles for environment, right?
of course,
Sounds great, but within the country itself, none of our policies of this government or previous governments have questioned the way lifestyles are going in India, especially by the rich, by people like me, for instance. 50 million, 100 million people who are actually living lifestyles that are almost equivalent to the rich in the industrialized West. We're not only not questioning that, we're actually promoting that. We're promoting that more and more and more in the way you look at advertisements, the way you look at the kind of inducements that are given to industries for the kinds of products that we are using. It is not in any way asking ourselves, life, as Mr. Modi put it, is not anywhere on the radar for government
of
policy.
course.
And
So
of course,
government,
as consumers, we are also responsible in some way.
government need to like find a way to find a sustainable behave, like give more impetus to the sustainable behavioral change in the society, like the behavior of
Yeah,
the.
and this is not about imposing things. It's not like I would not advocate that the government tells us that this is what you can consume and this is what you can't consume. It's actually about building policies, incentive programs, social processes which actually enable us to ask this question. I can talk later about, for instance, what are the changes needed in every sector, say construction, transportation, agriculture, which would actually enable us to live much more ecologically sensitive and friendly lifestyles without giving up on basic needs and on basic comforts. We're not talking about going back into some level of poverty, but actually how we can do this, and how the people who currently are deprived from those basic needs are the ones who can meet them without stressing the earth. So these are solutions. There are many of them. I can give some examples later on when we get into this.
And the first goal of Prime Minister Modi, achieving net zero by 2070. Uh, right now, you have said that the India, like, our plan is to increase the power generation by coal itself. So, this do you think like this goal is achievable or can be achieved in future, or
So,
does India even want to achieve?
sorry, does India?
Does India even wants to, or is just a commitment to greenwash, or is it really a reality which India wish to make?
So I think firstly, this is not just about India. Every country that's making these net zero announcements, some have said 2050. I think China has said 2060. India has just said 2070. Every one of these countries knows, but is hiding the fact that this is actually a cop out. See, basically, we're saying let's keep emitting, and we'll capture it somewhere, so that in the atmosphere, magically there'll be zero uh, carbon or methane or whatever. Now, firstly, this is based on futuristic, unproven technologies, which are
Of
going to
course.
magically capture that carbon and put it somewhere, right? Or convert it into something else. And or it's based on thinking of massive levels of plantations all over the world, which will absorb the carbon from the atmosphere. Now, in India, we know that plantations of this kind, for instance, which are done for what's called compensatory afforestation. So when you give permission to a dam to be constructed and you submerge, say, 1,000 hectares of forest, you say plant 2,000 hectares of forest somewhere else, right? It sounds great, but firstly, you can't compensate a natural forest by a plantation. Secondly, the plantations often come up on people's lands, and then people are displaced or their livelihoods are displaced. So if we're talking about massive levels of lakhs and lakhs of hectares of plantations to absorb the carbon that's being emitted elsewhere, we are also again talking about whose benefit and whose cost, right? So that's one big issue with net zero. The second big issue with net zero is that suppose you have a thermal power station. The thermal power station is not emitting only carbon or carbon dioxide or whatever, sorry, the greenhouse gases. It is also emitting other things. Now, if you keep letting it emit, it's going to keep damaging the population and the wildlife around it through sulfur and all kinds of other sorts of emissions. And you might be able to capture the carbon somewhere else, but that doesn't solve the problem of the people who are badly affected by the emissions from the thermal power station. The same thing with cars, the same thing with any kinds of emissions. And so it's a very limited way of looking at ecological damage and human damage caused by these sorts of things. It's a very carbon centric way of looking at things, but carbon is not the only element that is a problem in our industrialized way of life. There's many others that also have to be dealt with. So there is that problem of net zero. Um, Another issue with net zero is that nobody is, so far at least, I don't know if it's in the government plans or not, but nobody is talking about things like the industrialized livestock industry. Now, India also in its development pattern has moved increasingly away from the much more ecologically sustainable, free range kind of pastoralism, nomadic pastoralism, open seas fisheries and so on, which used to take place, still takes place by the traditional communities in India, into much more industrialized livestock and fisheries production, which is very climate intensive. The entire green revolution model, for instance, pumps fertilizers into our lands, and those are a part of the emissions. Or you have these massive, in India, not so big as say Brazil and so on, but they're coming in massive sort of livestock production units, which are also creating emissions. And so the net zero currently at least is not talking about that issue. And I don't see any changes in government policy on this, other than there was this recent announcement on zero budget farming or natural farming by the prime minister. But what does it really mean on the ground? Why is it that, for instance, we still are subsidizing chemical fertilizers by something like 80,000 or 90,000 crore rupees a year, and not saying, okay, let's over the next 5 years shift that whole thing into organic? Now, that would be a huge uh, solution to currently unsustainable forms of agriculture, and it would enable tens of millions of farmers to actually go into organic production, which will be beneficial for themselves, for the land, for all of us as consumers, basically for everybody. But also recognizing and respecting that in every place, uh, organic farming or natural farming will have a different uh, solution. It's not, you can't impose the same solution for the whole country, because we are so very diverse, right? Ecologically diverse and so on. And so you can't simply say, okay, we're going to do, say, zero budget or this form of thing, which is unfortunately how the government usually works. One solution, let's impose it all over the country, or the entire state. And that doesn't respect the kind of local diversity that is so very important, where in fact farmers themselves are finding all kinds of fantastic solutions for natural and sustainable farming. We need to look at those and support those if we really want to shift to agriculture that is ecologically and climate friendly. The same thing would go with, say, construction. Now, I haven't seen anywhere in government programs yet any significant announcement on how we can incentivize ecologically friendly construction. All across the country, people are constructing with cement and concrete, and now with these ugly glass cement structures all over in our big cities, right? none of which are climate friendly, none of which are ecologically friendly, none of which are even people friendly. You can sit inside and you'd be baking in the summer and you'd be freezing in the winter unless you had artificial cooling or heating. Now, whereas in fact we've had thousands of years of architecture in India from which we can learn the lessons of how we can make buildings that are weather sensitive and which in fact are warm in winter and cool in summer using natural materials. But we don't see any significant movements towards that, which would be a huge solution to actually reducing our carbon footprint of the, say, the entire construction industry, which is quite large. So these are some of the things that also I think much more discussion is needed and much more of a policy shift and people's movement on these sorts of things.
So, sir, like for fulfilling the demand and for increasing profitability, we have capitalized all modes of production, whether it's farming or we have like adopted the capitalized model. We have we don't have any incentive to take care of the ecology and the biodiversity of the region and take care of our own environment. We just want to make profit. That's why we're doing all this. Like not all of it, but most. So, so as
Yeah.
so sir, yeah, sir, you were saying something.
No, no, you finish and then I'll add.
Yeah, sir. So as you mentioned, like there are many solar parks being built, being like a new solar like in Kutch and in Ladakh, there are new solar parks are building and which are really large in area. And right now, even right now, India has the largest solar park, which is Bhadla Solar Park in Rajasthan, and it is 14,000 acres. And India has moved toward like harnessing more and more renewable energy, and it has 18 folded its solar power production, which is definitely going to be helpful in the future run to cut down the emission. But in large picture, these sparks are affecting the biodiversity of the region. So how can we harness these energy in a much more sustainable way?
Yeah, so let me get into. I mean, I've already hinted at some of the solutions, but maybe go in a little bit more detail. So, firstly, certainly we need to move towards solar, wind, and other such relatively clean sources of energy. But we should do the vast majority of that through decentralized sources, decentralized renewable energy, right? For instance, rooftop solar plants. Now, it has been estimated, I think, by Greenpeace India and others that in Delhi, some 30-40% of its energy needs, or maybe more, could be met with installing rooftop solar in across the tens of thousands of buildings in Delhi. The same thing could be for most other cities in the country. You can think of, for instance, decentralized grids for villages. Every village or every cluster of villages could have a local grid, which is either solar or solar plus wind or whatever the other sort of local, maybe even biomass, and combine all of that, and you can actually have the village itself controlling. Uh, Constructing, controlling, managing that thing. So it's totally independent. It's not relevant. It's not relying on a central grid which might fail at any point in time, right? And in fact, now increasingly in many countries, including some parts of India, there is a scheme by which you can sell back the power into the grid. So you're producing for yourself, you're self-reliant, and then you're also able to make some revenues by selling it back. In Delhi, for instance, many of the, I think some of the public schools have set up solar rooftop, and they are not just saving crores of rupees every year in energy bill, they're actually making money by selling it back into a grid. So to me, decentralized renewable energy is the biggest and now increasingly technically feasible and financially feasible solution to energy. Um, so that's about, say, energy, right? The other sectors are also equally important, though. Agriculture, I've already mentioned. I'll give you a simple example of what 5,000 Dalit women farmers, very poor, small landholders, no great sort of technological backing, no great financial backing, etc. In Telangana, these 5,000 Dalit women farmers have gone from a situation of hunger, malnutrition, lack of adequate production, etc., to one of complete food security in all those 5,000 families, and also what they call food sovereignty or Anna Swaraj, which means we have complete control over the making of the food. But in the process, switching completely to organic, all local seeds, all rain fed, no external irrigation, etc., they are practicing some of the most climate friendly and biodiversity friendly agriculture that you can think of, right? Now, if 5,000 Dalit women farmers can do that without any significant external support, why can't this happen with all the farmers in India if the government were to provide the right kind of support? And that would be a huge shift away from climate emissions from agriculture. Third, I've already talked to you about the construction sector. There's a group called Hunarshala in Kutch, which has done some fantastic work on mud, compressed mud, and roof, thatch roof kind of construction for that part of the country. But they've also worked in Uttarakhand and Bihar and so on, actually showing how local materials can be used to construct buildings that are weather friendly and much cheaper and much more sustainable than, say, cement concrete. So that's the third sector of construction. You can do that even with bigger and bigger buildings, as people are showing. The fourth sector would be transportation. That's also a huge problem in terms of climate. Now, with transportation, instead of simply saying we will switch from fossil fuel driven cars to electric cars, which is like the big shift happening all over the world, right? And even I think Prime Minister Modi spoke about it some time back. Instead of that, why are we not going much more into making all of our cities much more public transport friendly and much more cycling and walking friendly? So I cycle from home to work and back 15 kilometers, both ways in Pune. But every time I do that, I'm breathing in a lot of pollution and I'm unsafe on the road because there is no cycling lane, right? So if the government was serious about climate, or about people's safety or about the environment, it would say every city must prioritize cycling lanes, must prioritize walking, and must prioritize public transportation over private vehicles. Now, that would be a solution to a whole lot of things, including the mobility of poor people, including ecological problems and climate crisis. So, there are solutions like this available everywhere. They have proven, they have been shown to work. Is the government serious enough to look at them, learn from them, and then support their spread all over the country? So far, I'm afraid not. But of course, we'll have to keep pushing to make them much more receptive to these things.
So that's really a great answer you made. So like there's this movement going on mimicking the nature, like in construction, in agriculture, everywhere. We try to make the nature have production according to the nature and the biodiversity and ecology of the region. So that is the solution. Obviously, you made that. And in the transport sector, as you said, like I am currently in Delhi, and Delhi is very unsafe for cycling, like especially in flyovers and walking. Though you cannot walk in flyovers, never.
Yeah.
Like you cannot even dare to do that. So like government needs to focus on that. And just one last question before I switch give this platform to the our audience for asking more questions to you directly. The last question is: will switching to renewable energies increase the economic inequalities within India population? Like, if we switch to the renewable energy, will it increase the economic inequalities in India? If yes, how can we minimize it?
Yeah, so I think, Farhan, the assumption here is that renewable energy is much more expensive, which is an assumption that has to be questioned because, see, if you add all the ecological and social costs of, say, coal-based power production, it is likely to be much more expensive than a decentralized solar
Of
solution, or
course.
a decentralized wind solution, or a decentralized biomass based solution, right? Whatever is relevant for that area, or
Of
a
course.
mixed grid of all of these. So if that is the case, and I think energy experts have shown that, then in fact you can actually provide power at equivalent or cheaper costs than what is being provided through coal or nuclear. Nuclear anyway is way too expensive, or large hydro. And that's the but it requires a shift in thinking. It's the mental shift of putting all the costs into every source of energy rather than outsourcing the cost, rather than externalizing the cost. The ecological costs of coal production are not internalized. Otherwise, you and I would actually be paying much more for our electricity, right? So we're actually being subsidized by the environment without even often knowing it. So I think that's one crucial point there. The second very important point is that with decentralized renewable energy, as I said earlier, people would actually be much more able to control their energy uh, destiny and their energy futures. In every settlement, you could actually have a few young people trained into constructing, managing uh, these sorts of energy sources, which currently we have no control over because somebody in some central grid institution is actually controlling our energy consumption and production. So I think that's a very important part also of democracy, that we will that decentralized renewable energy sources are also much more democratic, much more enabling of communities to control, as I said, their own destiny and their own future, right? And it could provide enormous employment opportunities for people in villages. Right now villages have this huge employment crisis, right? That's why so many people are leaving and going into cities. But if you were to actually able to have this mix of agricultural transformation, local manufacturing, including renewable energy sources, and so many other things, which would include both traditional occupations and modern occupations, you could actually generate enormous employment in the villages, and people might, in fact, want to come back. And I have there we have many examples where there's reverse migration, where in fact villages have been revitalized in these ways. So we have to, I think, move towards that. But one thing I want to come back to, and I'll end there, is that if one wants to deal with economic inequalities of this, which whether it's with energy or any of these other kinds, and if we want to deal with the ecological insensitivity of our current models of development, it also means challenging the macro economy and the macro political structures, which means, who, as I said right at the beginning, who takes decisions. If we want to continue moving towards a state dominated and capitalist dominated economy and society, then these solutions will simply not be heard. You know, why would, for instance, let's say any X big industry want to support local control of energy production? It undermines their profits and their power, right? So nobody will want that. If you were to ask any of these big industries, they obviously will not support something like that. Same thing with agriculture, with seeds, with water, with everything. That the more you decentralize decision making on this, the more these centralized powers get threatened. And that's one big reason why we don't actually move into this. Why is it that, for instance, when we say 500 gigawatts of renewable energy, why is most of that going to go into
Solar
giving
parks.
leases and permissions to the biggest corporations of the country, or the biggest corporations of the world, actually, right? Rather than saying, let every community over the next 5 years create the capacity to produce this power, right? So unless we challenge those fundamental structures, and including the democratic decision making processes, that every settlement, what is grams, our constitution talks about decentralized governance, right? Decision making by bodies of local self governance, but truly in fact has power been handed down to the gram sabhas or the urban area sabhas, etc.? It's not. There is no financial power, there are no legal powers that they have. So these are also the sorts of changes that one will have to think about if we really want ecologically, socially sensitive and equitable society.
All right, sir. So, like the decentralization is the key. Like as Gandhiji said, that village has to be supreme in our country, and they have to be autonomous. So, decentralizing to the level of households in energy sector would like would give more power to individuals to harness their own uh, energy requirements and fulfill their energy requirements and energy resources.
Yeah, you'd have to think about different levels. I mean, some things the household can do, some things the community can do, some things a cluster of settlements can do. It depends really on what the objective is, what is the source of power, etc. Sorry, what is this? Yeah, what's the source of energy? Depending on that, you can think of different levels of different gradations of energy production or water harvesting or food production, whatever it is your basic needs are. But it is evident, it is eminently possible that if not a single village, a cluster of 10 villages or 20 villages, maybe 20 villages and a town, could within itself, within its radius, produce at least all the basic needs. All the household items, etc., can be produced there. And then you trade for things that are not possible in your own region to produce. You can trade it with somebody else. But why do we have long distance trade for things like food and water and energy, which can all be produced in a certain localized thing? So this is also then a movement against economic globalization and for economic localization. I just want to add one quick point here, which is very important, is that localization has to also go hand in hand with struggles for social justice and equity, because otherwise we also have casteism, we have gender inequalities. All of these things are in a lot of traditional villages and in towns that is still very, very strong. So we also have to be able to look at how, in fact, these most marginalized sections of people, Dalits, Adivasis, women, etc., so-called people with disabilities, are able to have also an equal and central voice in decision making. So it's this combination that is very, very important.
That's really good point. So thank you so much. I guess our audience must have gotten a lot from you, and now I open this discussion for all the questions from the audience. Uh, so we have Dev Nagar and Adarsh.
Hello, sir. Hi, Farhan. A really great conversation. Really enjoyed it. And there are a lot of people, I assume, who have joined us online on StreamYard and other on YouTube, and they must have enjoyed the conversation throughout. So one specific thing which I've been looking forward to ask somebody like you is that in the recent, like a couple months back, there was this a lot of debate upon the new scheme by the government that like aims to bring up palm oil plantations in different parts of India, and the specific focus has been in the northeastern region and the Andaman and Nicobar Islands. So now I see like both these regions are very ecologically fragile, and bringing up clearing thousands of hectares of forest land and growing oil plantations over there can have really detrimental effects on our ecosystem. The similar model, like I did some research, so in Sri Lanka as well, they tried this. They tried to encourage and incentivize plantations by farmers over there, and within a span of few years, everything got like out of hand, because the oil plantation in itself is a very resource intensive crop. Like they require like tons and tons of water and other resources, so the fertility of the soil in itself lowers down within a period of a few years. But at the same time, when I have to debate it with somebody, so they say that India is palm oil deficient, so we have to anyways import it from some other country. So to have that sort of a self-reliance, we need to find a balance. So I would just like to hear from you as to what exactly is your take. And it's not just about like palm oil plantations, it's about every other thing, because whenever we try to do something, it might not be sustainable in some or the other sense. So how do we balance the developmental activities along with sustainability and along with the concerns of the marginalized communities per se, indigenous and the Adivasi people? So that's what I wanted to ask.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. So I think, I mean, you already said what the problems with the palm oil plantations could be, and especially in fragile areas like Northeast and the Andaman Islands. You've seen devastating effects in Sri Lanka. We've seen devastating impacts in Malaysia and other Southeast Asian countries, right? Massive, massive devastation. I mean, it's nothing that can be hidden. So we will have the same thing happening here. Now, I think, if I'm not mistaken, Sri Lanka has subsequently actually banned it. Uh, now, the issue is one of why and how much do we need palm oil? So this relates again to the same point I was making about energy, which is demand management. We have gone into a kind of economy in which any and every demand is justified, and then we figure out how to produce it, right? So what is palm oil used in? Let's ask ourselves those sorts of questions. For instance, soap. Can't we produce soap without palm oil? Of course we can. We've done it for thousands of years. Yeah. So palm oil is hardly used in cooking in India, right? So let's look at what are the products that palm oil uses, and then say, okay, are there alternatives? Yeah. If it's, for instance, for poor people, and supposedly say for cooking, every settlement or every cluster of settlements can actually have a source of oil or several sources of oil which it itself is able to produce. You don't need those massive sorts of plantations. Oil, in India, we have so many, such an incredible diversity of oils, and there are new ones also being found in plants. So let's use those, let's innovate on those, and say, how can a community or a cluster of communities be self-sufficient with regard to all the oil that it needs, whether it's for cooking or it's for any other purpose? That is the way to go, rather than saying, okay, we have this much palm oil demand, let's produce it somewhere. We don't want to import it from Southeast Asia. And in the name of self-reliance, let's cut down forests in Andaman Nicobar Islands and Northeast India and put palm oil there. It's just the wrong way to go about doing things. It relates to what I was saying earlier, that unless we actually question the model of development itself, the macroeconomy of this, and who really benefits, again, it's going to be corporations who will be doing the controlling the plantations and then making profits from whatever palm oil is produced and put into products. Who benefits, who loses out? All these questions have to be asked if we want to question it. Simply saying it's bad for Andamans and Northeast will not be enough. And that's because what you're saying, right? People will say, "ठीक है, maybe it's bad, but we need it. We don't want to import it from." So then you really have to go into the question of, do we need it? And if so, how much is needed, and for what, and for whom? For every mode of production or thing of we're producing, we have to ask those questions.
All right, sir. Thank you so much.
Yeah, so sir, so this is in regards to something that you said before, like you said that like any kind of measures that we put that can't be like properly done if the whole system is either state dominant or capitalism dominant, right? So so the thing is like in the past, if you see like any kind of revolution to any system that is taking place was mostly driven by some capitalist entity. Like if you see like the internet or electric vehicles or globalization or cashless transactions or anything. And on the other hand, countries which have put in like major changes like towards the environment, or, like anything in that arena, like most Scandinavian countries, they have very high tax rates, right? So and the average income is also high. So like my question is how to find a balance between these two in a country like India, and if even if like if it is even possible.
Sorry, just to understand your question, balance between, say, technological innovations, etc., by the big corporations and
Yeah,
what,
and
and
state
welfare.
promotion of the greener and like anything that
Ah,
helps the citizens, that is.
okay. So I think firstly we need to ask ourselves, through human history, have most technological, when you say revolutions, I presume you meant technological revolutions, because the examples you gave were of technology like internet, etc. Have technological revolutions actually been done by big corporations, or have they been done by ordinary people in different circumstances? I always ask this question. Does anybody know who invented the wheel? Do you know it?
No,
Yeah, we
And would
did.
any of our current technological innovations work without the wheel?
I mean,
So I
some.
can give you hundreds and thousands of examples of where some ordinary person somewhere innovated, has never claimed a intellectual property right on it. People don't know their names, and yet they've actually revolutionized society. Let's take even the modern technological innovations. What is produced through Microsoft or Apple is largely based, or very heavily based, on thousands and thousands of people's thinking and innovation in open software, right? Which is then just picked up, and then a few changes here and there, and then it becomes proprietary ownership of these big corporations. Yeah. Same thing with seeds. Our so-called agricultural green revolution technologies, innovations, green revolution by the government institutions and or by corporations, are mostly based on an incredible diversity of seeds that has been evolved by farmers, so-called illiterate farmers, over the last few thousand years. In India, we have had 300,000 varieties of rice, none of them produced by these formal institutions, all of them by so-called ordinary farmers, right? Now, you can take virtually any such sector. The problem is that right now we're so heavily focused on modern glitzy technologies that we tend to think that this can only happen by these corporations who have a lot of money or governments who actually have a lot of money. And that is simply not the case. If we are able to re-democratize technological innovations, you'll find that fantastic things can be done and are done. Even the World Wide Web. Who created the World Wide Web? You know the name of the guy? I'm also now right now forgetting it. But he has come out very openly and said he's astounded and very upset by how companies have taken private ownership over aspects of the World Wide Web or the internet. He did not develop it as a means to make profits. He said it should be something that should be for all humankind. But you get a capitalist system which then appropriates that and makes profits from it. So that's one big aspect there. The second is, if governments really do want to help, then they need to be able to support this kind of democratic innovations, democratic research and R&D, let's say, right? Which in the past people have done. In India also, a lot of R&D, public sector R&D was supported by the government. Today we're increasingly saying, okay, let private corporations do it, and then we will take it from them. And that's a trend that we really have to question. When it comes to taxation, and then using that taxation for public welfare, which say the Scandinavian countries and others are very good at. Also in India, that's been an argument that if you were to simply put a 2% profit tax on the richest people in India, okay, wealth tax on the richest people in India, and a 1 or 2% inheritance tax, you would generate money that is equivalent to the being able to fund the entire rural employment guarantee scheme, the entire food distribution PDS and all that scheme, the entire health scheme for all poor people in the country, etc. Meaning basically all the welfare schemes of the government could be funded by just a 2% wealth tax and a 1% inheritance tax on the richest 1% of India. Will the government do it? No, because it's in the pockets of these people. And I'm not talking about only this government, it's successive governments have been like this. So if we were serious about welfare, and there was a phase in which we brought in the National Rural Employment Guarantee Act and the Right to Information Act and the Forest Rights Act and all these sorts of things, some of them welfare oriented things. So there was a phase in which we were beginning to get a lot of these progressive policies and laws, but that's gone long back. But if we were serious about welfare, if we wanted to go and use, say, Scandinavia as a good example of, say, public welfare, it's a bad example for a lot of other things, but let's say for public welfare, it's good. Then this is what we need to do. And repeatedly, activists, economists, academics, people within government also have argued for higher tax on the richest companies and individuals in India. But that has, in fact, if anything, it's actually been reduced, taxation rate. So I think, that's how you would then, and then you could use that money for supporting democratic R&D and innovations in various different fields. But that's just not the way we're going, unfortunately, in India. Sorry, others, does that respond to your?
Yes, I'm not completely satisfied though. Uh,
No? Well, go ahead. You can ask me more.
so there are like various discrepancies. Like in the initially the point that you started with itself, like individuals bringing about change by themselves, right? So like these are like very few examples in the sense, like take the wheel for example. That was created because of necessity, right? That was just the beginning of technological innovation in the sense, and then you came up with weapons and everything because there was a necessity. And in the past 200 years, you see like most technological innovation was caused like because people are at war, like the Cold War, World War II, right? Most like nuclear technology or anything that came up, it's because of war. Again, it was necessity. But right now, like the world is at peace, right? And if you see like people don't need a lot of technological innovation just to survive, that is. So I think monetary like money is an incentive. So you are saying that the conception that only corporations can come up with new stuff is mainly because they normally hire like highly skilled individuals, right? And these people need money to make stuff. So that's why I was asking that if money is the only incentive that people have to come up with new stuff, how do we find the balance? That is the main thing that
But
I
that,
don't
others,
understand.
that's what I'm questioning. Is it? Who invented Linux? Is
I
that
don't know.
person and or team making lots of money? They're not. They said
They're
we've
not.
invented it. It's a fantastic software. We're going to give it. Anybody can use it and actually innovate on it and do what they want with it. There's an
Right.
incredible revolution with open software, with copyleft, with freeware. With I mean, there are different sorts of terms there are different terms that are used for all of this. All of whom are extremely intelligent people. And what is their motivation? Not making money. Their motivation is to do something good for society. Do you think others seriously that motivation has actually gone down?
No, sir. But the thing
So
is,
then why
there are
can't we
lot
say,
more things
no,
that we
why
want to
can't,
do now, right?
sorry?
Like there are a lot more things that we want to know. For example, I myself, like obviously, I want to contribute to society, but then I also want money. I want to go like travel the world.
Of course. So why can't we create a society in which those needs, not luxuries, okay, those needs, your desires, your needs, are met through a public process? So, for instance, suppose you innovate and create a new technological product or software or whatever it is. Let society recognize you. You
Right.
should be recognized as somebody who's actually done this, and there could also then be support to for you to do further innovations, or for you to, I don't
Right.
know, at least live a life that is not a life of deprivation. Now, if you're saying that you also want to make money to travel all over the world and or have a 27-story building for one family, which I'm sure you know who I'm talking about, then I'm sorry, that's not what our society can afford.
Right.
The earth can't afford it.
Right.
So, what do you need the money for? Is it for greed, so that you can continue doing all this thing? Doesn't matter what the hell happens to the earth or to other people, or is it for genuine needs and, of course, some aspirations?
Right.
Everybody wants to travel once in a while, yeah. But that, I mean, unless we ask these fundamental questions, we can say bye
Sir,
bye to
I
the
think
earth
it's
and to
also
ourselves.
about the power, right? It's also
Of
about
course,
power.
it's about power. Absolutely,
Yeah.
it is
Yeah.
absolutely about
Because
power. Who gave permission to one family to build a 27-story mansion for themselves in Mumbai? To
right.
sheer power. Does it make any sense whatsoever? It doesn't make any sense at all. Forget ecology, it doesn't make any other sense. But the guy's got the power, so he's made it. Doesn't even look good. It's a horrible looking building. That's a separate issue. But so, I mean, if we have a society in which anybody can basically do anything, it's a free for all, then forget about climate, forget about environment, forget about equality, forget about any of these sorts of things. And eventually it's going to rebound on us now. I
Yes.
mean, if half of Mumbai is going to be underwater, they can probably still live on the 27th story floor, but and jump straight into the sea for swimming. But eventually it rebounds on all of us. We're seeing that. We're seeing that with people. Even the rich are dying because of air pollution in Delhi. Yeah, the Chennai airport was under floods 3-4 years back, so nobody could take even a flight, even the richest, however rich you might be. So eventually, it actually also going to backfire even on the rich, but probably much after the poor have all disappeared. So
Yes.
So
Understood.
unless we have to ask ourselves these questions.
Yes. So I have a small observation regarding something you said before. Like you said that like people should be given opportunity based on their contributions, right? Just an observation, like just a comment though. Like the two biggest examples would probably be Nazi Germany and like present China. People who contributed more, scientists and etc. were like made military officers and stuff like that. Just an observation though.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, I think what the rewards could be also needs to be asked, right?
Yes.
This question about what is a right, what is a just reward, what is something that, and I think this also relates to, for instance, our education system. In schools, what are we taught these days? Okay, I mean, earlier it was different. These days, we're taught that your goals in life should be about becoming rich, famous, and powerful, or at least one of those three, if not all three, right? If in schools we actually had an education system where all of us were brought up in an environment, not told in a moralizing way, but brought up in an environment in which we became responsible human beings, where I didn't have the aspiration of coming first in class, but I had the aspiration of making sure that everybody in my class, including those who are struggling, are able to move up into the next level of learning and understanding. I would grow up as a human being who would not be aspiring for becoming richer and richer and richer at the expense of whoever else, but a human being who would say, I want to be creative, I want to be innovative, I want to be recognized for my innovations, but not for becoming more and more powerful and more rich and more famous. So it also then relates to how actually we are bringing up our own children, how we were brought up, and how we're bringing up our children. What are the aspirations that we are actually putting into their heads? That becomes a very important part of this. I mean, I'm not the education thing is a whole other subject, um, but unless we actually also look at that, we're going to keep creating people who are going to be greedy for as individual selfish beings. Why is it that the most popular photograph these days in the world is the selfie? Think about it. Not simply because we've got the technology to make selfies. It's really about people. Oh, I am the most important person on earth, and so I want to take a picture of myself and put it up on Instagram and Facebook and wherever. Um, unless we really seriously ask ourselves, and who benefits from all of that? The capitalists who will give you this thing saying, oh, the next iPhone has an even better camera to take your selfie from. Where you don't ask yourself the question, maybe the first iPhone or even before that, another camera was actually good enough for me. So, who feeds all those desires into our head? It's those guys who actually will profit from our feeling insecure and unsatisfied with the current technology, not because it in any way inconveniences us, but because there's a new technology coming. Oh gosh, that person has it. Why don't I have it? That's what most of these technological innovations are nothing to do with basic needs, nothing whatsoever. So when you said, for instance, that there was a need for those innovations, whether it was poverty or war or mobility or whatever it is, today it's not out of need, it's out of some other things. It is out of capitalist greed. There's absolutely no logic for iPhone 13 to be replaced by iPhone 14 in 6 months. Is there, other than capitalist greed? Nothing.
No.
So, what technological innovations which are not arising out of need are they needed? Also has to be asked. This question has to be asked. And by the
Thank
way,
you.
was the wheel invented out of need? I have no idea. Nobody knows this. Maybe somebody was just playing around and said, "Oh, this looks like an interesting shape. Maybe it'll be useful. Let's see what works out of it." We don't know whether it came purely out of need. Human intellectual curiosity, the urge to do something new and different. That could also have been a motivation, and still is a motivation for lots of inventions. But I think this could be actually an interesting conversation for a separate session.
Yeah, sir. Thank you so much, sir. We're already 25 minutes up the time limit. So thank you so much, Adarsh, for having a giving a great question and interesting question, and also Dave for giving a great question, and thank you so much, Ashish sir, for being patient and educating us, inspiring us, and making us more aware about these stuffs. So,
Farhan, sorry, I forgot to. I must do this because I forgot to
uh,
put up a
all right,
cartoon.
sir.
Can I just show you one as a last kind of
Yeah, yeah, sure,
parting
please.
shot? Parting shot. Let's see if I can show it to you. Uh, so the idea, my and a fellow cartoonist idea of Panchamrit was this.
So we cannot see it.
You can't see it? Oh, okay. In my thing, it's saying
Yeah, yes,
it's.
sir.
You saw it now. See it now?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So I just wanted to end with this. So it's
It's
really a
wonderful,
punch.
sir. So it is developed by you, and sir, can we get that thing? Like, if
I'll
you would
send it to you.
want, yeah, if you would want to post it as a souvenir in our social media.
Sure. I'll
So
email it to you.
thank you so much, sir. And thank you so much, sir, for being so patient and for giving us so much insightful knowledge. Now let's uh, just end this session. Thank you so much, audience, for being patient and for being here with us for 1 hour and 12 minutes. I hope you must have gotten a lot from it and must have learned a lot. Thank you so much. Signing out.